afterwards and watch it over and over again, because I know you'll want to. My name is Brenda Marcichuk. I'm the Director of Communications here at Madison Audubon. Caitlin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name's Caitlin. I am a communications specialist here with Madison Audubon, and I am sort of new. I just started over the summer. So nice to see you all.
We are so glad to have you here tonight with us for an Evenings with Audubon program. I'm going to give just a quick introduction before we get started for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. We are a local nonprofit that is a chapter of National Audubon, but a separate organization. We work with folks like you to protect land for birds, for animals, for people, for all sorts of native species, and allow folks to access that land anytime. We're a nationally accredited land trust, which means that our properties are protected forever and available for anyone to explore and enjoy. So we have about 2,000 acres right now. We also do a lot of citizen science and advocacy work. Many of our folks on tonight are bald eagle nest watch volunteers who are really engaged with lead poisoning issues as it relates to bald eagles. And many of them have had to do some work to help some bald eagles that they have found to have lead poisoning. So we do a lot of community work in that way. We also do a lot of education programming for kids in schools and community centers across the greater Madison area in southern Wisconsin. And we have these presentation series. So tonight we are really tickled to be joined by Sean Strom of the Wisconsin DNR to talk about lead exposure in some of our beloved Wisconsin birds. I'll let Sean introduce himself, but before I hand it over, I'm going to make just a quick note of how we're going to do this presentation tonight. So Sean will give his presentation for about 40 minutes or so. And if you have any questions along the way, you can put those into the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, there's a little button that says chat. If you're on your phone, I can't remember where it's at, but it's somewhere. So you can type those questions in as they come to mind along the way. And at the end, we'll read them all off to Sean and he'll be able to answer them, give some insight right away. If you're watching this on Facebook, either live or afterwards, you can type your questions into the comments box and we'll get to those as we're able to as well. With that, I'll hand it over, and Sean, thank you. Take it away.
My pleasure. I will turn my video on for a split second. I live kind of in a rural area. And so just to show that I am actually a real person, but I'm going to stop it because, like I said, I live in a rural area, and the internet is not too strong. And whenever you put on video, you're kind of rolling the dice of whether or not the whole system will crash. So I'm going to share my screen. Actually, I'll kind of introduce myself first. So I've been with the DNR now for 20 plus years. I am currently the fish and wildlife toxicologist. So I work both in the fisheries and wildlife programs. I spent the majority of my career in the wildlife health program. And then a few years ago, I was shifted job duties a little bit and now cover both fish and wildlife. But throughout pretty much my entire career, even going back to graduate school, I've covered issues of lead in wildlife and specifically lead in birds. So it's kind of a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So I will share the screen. And can you see that? Good? Okay.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, I'll do. All right. So purpose of my presentation is simply just to kind of discuss and tell what we have observed now over the past 20-ish years of looking at lead exposure in Wisconsin birds. Had a lot of help with this, primarily through the DNR's Wildlife Health Program. And like I said, it's been an ongoing effort that involves a lot of different people. So just to kind of go back in time a little bit and discuss the history and background of lead poisoning. This is certainly not a new issue. Lead poisoning in birds has been reported as far back as the late 1800s. If you go back in the literature, I think 1880s or 1890s, there's documentation and reports of lead poisoned birds. And over the course of time, it led to a federal ban on the use of lead shot for waterfowl hunting in the United States in 1991. Canada followed suit around 1997. And, as a result of this ban on lead shot for waterfowl hunting, lead poisoning cases have certainly declined, but they are still relatively common. And that's kind of two reasons behind that. The first is historic deposits of lead, lead that was shot 50, 60, 70 years ago. It's still in the environment. A lot of people say, well, it sinks down deep in the sediment. Yes, it does, but I'm sure you all know how small a lead shot pellet is. And so it is dense and heavy. It can still only sink so far down into the sediment. And of course, you have sedimentation that helps bury it as well. But in many places, those deposits of lead can still be available to some bird species. And then there's also the continued use of lead in other activities, and that includes fishing, upland game hunting, and bullet fragmentation from centerfire rifle ammunition. So, lead is an element, so it's very persistent in the environment and can remain for hundreds and hundreds of years. When lead is ingested by a bird, the retention time is highly variable. It can be less than 24 hours, or it can be as long as 3 weeks. And usually, the longer the retention time, the more likely you will observe toxic effects. So when lead is ingested by a bird, it's usually eroded in the gizzard, and there's a very highly acidic environment of, a pH of about 2, sometimes less than 2 in the gizzard. And the muscular activity combined with this acidic environment really facilitates the dissolution of the metallic lead. And what that simply means is that, by nature, metallic lead isn't all that bioavailable, but when you put it in that acidic environment, the bioavailability increases greatly, and therefore you have possibility of increased absorption. So birds are especially sensitive to lead. Mammalian wildlife may be a little bit more tolerant, but we still really don't know as much about mammalian wildlife. There has been some reports and papers regarding predators such as wolves and bears, but as a kind of comparatively, mammalian wildlife appears to be a little bit more tolerant of lead exposure compared to birds. So there's two kind of types of lead poisoning. The first is considered primary lead poisoning, and that's simply the direct ingestion of a lead shot or sinker or fishing weight. And it can impact a wide variety of species. Primarily in Wisconsin, you see this primary exposure in trumpeter swans and common loons, and sometimes you see it in waterfowl where they can access historic deposits of lead. The second type is secondary lead poisoning, and this is where a predator or scavenger consumes an animal or parts of an animal that contain lead. In Wisconsin, the big one here that kind of is exposed to this secondary poisoning are bald eagles. And, birds can recover from lead exposure, but while they're exposed and they're potentially experiencing the adverse impacts, they're a much higher risk of predation or trauma. So the toxic effects of lead exposure are many. I'm not going to go through all of them, but anorexia and anemia are two big ones. Muscular tremors for waterfowl, especially this wing drop where the birds cannot hold their wings up upon their backs like they normally do. Lethargy and the inability to walk and run, as I had mentioned, just makes birds that are exposed more susceptible to either predation or trauma, such as being hit by cars. And ultimately, the death is obviously the big endpoint that we see in a lot of these birds. So this is a picture of a lead poisoned common loon, and that green staining around the vent is one of the telltale signs of lead poisoning, and those are bile deposits that are excreted, and you see this around the tail feathers of lead poisoned birds. Another kind of telltale sign or characteristic is atrophied pectoral muscle. Some refer to this as hatchet breast, and so that common loon on the bottom, you can see it has a very, very pronounced keel, where the loon on top that was not lead poisoned, you can see has very good body condition, muscle tone. So, when we do these necropsies and you see a bird that's got the stained feathers and you feel it and it's got that pronounced keel, there's a high likelihood that individual bird most likely succumbed to lead poisoning. So lead poisoning has been documented in numerous species of birds in Wisconsin. Lead exposure has been studied extensively in several species. And so for the remainder of my talk, I'm just going to kind of go through and tell the story of what we observed in each of these different species. So I'm going to start with American woodcock, and woodcock are not a species that you immediately jump to when you think about lead exposure. But in the mid 1990s, there was a researcher with the Canadian Wildlife Service by the name of Tony Schuhammer, who started looking at lead and upland game birds, specifically woodcock. And he observed very, very high levels of lead in the bones of woodcock. And so knowing that there's a pretty strong breeding population of woodcock here in Wisconsin, we started to look at lead levels of woodcock here in Wisconsin. And so these were 5 primary collection sites. Pretty much covers the northern half of Wisconsin, which is where most of the woodcock breeding habitat is. And when we did the initial survey, we did it at a lot more locations than this, but every year we kind of narrowed it down more and more till eventually we ended up just looking at the Mead Wildlife Area in the center part of the state and the Navarino Wildlife Area in the northeast part of the state. And what we found is very interesting. So I'll kind of walk you through this. So this graph is bone lead concentration by age and location. So you have the different age groups according to the different wildlife area on the bottom. And the most interesting thing and alarming thing are the green bars, which are woodcock chicks. So those are less than 7 days old, and the red bars, which are juvenile woodcock. So those are woodcock that were harvested by some of our department staff in August or so. So we knew that they were not migratory. And then when we aged them, definitely that they were young of year. So what we observed were very high levels of lead in the bones, especially at the Mead Wildlife Area. And then, and also in juveniles at several of the different wildlife areas, mainly Mead and the Peshtigo Wildlife Area. And that dashed line at 20 micrograms per gram, that is a level that is considered highly elevated in waterfowl. So we didn't have lead criteria for specifically for woodcock, and so we just used guidelines or criteria that were established for waterfowl. And so what the alarming thing is that these woodcock chicks, that are less than 7 days old or so, have or had bone lead concentrations that would likely have made a duck pretty sick. But we did not observe any ill effects in terms of behavior or anything. So it's kind of a mystery, but it's clear that the woodcock were being exposed to lead, and they accumulated this lead very quickly. So the next question is like, well, where is this lead coming from? So we used a process called stable isotope analysis to identify the source of lead contamination. And what stable isotope analysis does is that it measures the ratio of different lead isotopes. And these ratios can then be characteristic of a potential source. And unfortunately, the wing bone analysis was inconclusive. The results overlapped with ratios of both natural lead ores and anthropogenic lead. And this is just kind of a graphic of that. So you have what's characteristic of anthropogenic lead kind of right in the middle, and then natural lead ores, they're kind of in the lower left. And what we observed in our Wisconsin woodcock was that it overlapped directly with both sources. And so we really weren't able to point a finger at any one source. What we did do some other biomarker work, and they did not, the woodcock chicks did not seem to be impacted greatly. And so this is still kind of an unsolved mystery, unsolved problem. We don't have a lot of answers, other than we know that woodcock can accumulate fairly high levels of lead very quickly. The question is whether or not it's harmful to woodcock. Personally, myself and some other researchers that I've talked to think that, well, maybe woodcock are one of the bird species that are fairly tolerant of lead, but those are still some unanswered questions. So I'm going to switch now to trumpeter swans. So this is a mortality graph that shows the percent of mortality that's attributed to all these different sources. And you might question the title of the graph. It's like, well, why is it only till 2007? You probably know that that's pretty close to when trumpeter swans were delisted. So up until that point, we pretty much did a necropsy on every swan that was reported to our department. And so, we looked at close to 140 plus cases, and lead toxicity and trauma by far and away were the two main mortality factors for swans. Upwards of 25% of all trumpeter swan deaths were attributed to lead poisoning. So we also looked at swan blood, through the trumpeter swan banding program that our agency was involved in for many years. We collected a lot of blood samples, just shy of 1,200. The vast majority of these samples were from juvenile swans. And the good thing is that, 60+% were non-detects, meaning that no lead was detected in the blood at all. But roughly 15% were above what's considered background. So that red bar on the right, that 0.2 microgram per milliliter, anything above that is considered exposed, and below that is kind of considered background. And so, you know, roughly 15% of the trumpeter swans are exposed to at least some lead. Some high amounts, some not so much, but that 15% is, you know, at least some lead exposure. So how are swans exposed? How are they getting to this lead? Well, the feeding habits of swans might predispose them to lead exposure. You know, with their long necks, they can dig down deep into the sediment. And so, you know, especially in areas where there was a lot of historical waterfowl hunting during the lead shot era. If that lead is still available, perhaps in low water years where it's even more accessible, we still get cases of lead poisoned swans. And the majority of the lead poisoning is likely from lead shot, but we do get cases where swans ingest lead fishing weights, you know, split shot sinker, or a small fishing weight, and also then succumb to lead poisoning. So lead shot is the primary source for swans, but lead fishing weights are also a source. Jumping to bald eagles, this photo that I took from Ryan Brady shows one of the primary routes of exposure, and that is bald eagles consuming parts of animals that potentially have lead fragments or lead artifacts in them. So this is a mortality graph similar to the one that I showed you with trumpeter swans, and similar, you know, while bald eagles were still listed, we did necropsies on every eagle that was reported to our agency. And so it's close to 600 cases. And I've been asked, it's like, well, why don't we continue looking? And, you know, my answer to that is like, well, we looked at 600 cases and, you know, things on the landscape haven't changed so much. So we do not anticipate that these numbers really will have moved at all, you know, since we stopped this intense monitoring. And, you know, the number one killer of bald eagles are cars, you know, road kills, you know, they're eating roadkill, and they need a fair amount of space to get back airborne again. And unfortunately, a lot of times they come into contact with cars. That being said, lead toxicity accounts for about 15% of bald eagle mortalities. So obviously trauma is by far and away the number one killer of eagles, but lead toxicity is certainly still a significant factor. And so this is a graph that shows lead poisoning in eagles according to month. And you can see that it shows a very distinct pattern where you see lead poisoning cases that start to kind of tick up in October, they peak in December, and then they kind of tail off after the fact. And if you kind of overlay this with the hunting seasons in Wisconsin, it's a pretty good match. You know, most of the hunting seasons start in October. We have our 9-day gun hunt that starts this Saturday, so mid to late November, and then it tails off after that. So, you know, you get a lot of eagles that get exposed to lead in the late November, kind of early December, and throughout the December months. And this is not unique to Wisconsin. When I first kind of put these numbers together quite a few years ago. A colleague of mine from Minnesota, we were joking that we stole each other's data because the data from Minnesota is essentially identical. And you do get some yearly variations. If we get a lot of early snowfall where those carcasses are covered up, then sometimes this graph will shift a little bit. You'll get maybe a few more cases in the spring when those carcasses, the snow melts and those carcasses are exposed to the eagles again. But overall, yeah, this pretty much tells us that lead ammunition is a significant source of poisoning in Wisconsin's bald eagles. So, how are they exposed? As I had kind of mentioned, our data should suggest that lead ammunition is a significant source, and it can be from scavenging unrecovered animals, scavenging gut piles, or preying upon wounded animals. If the animal is wounded but doesn't die, the eagle can come and prey upon that and then succumb to that secondary poisoning. And the thing with bullet fragments, especially in gut piles, the fragments are really, really small. And so when we get a lead poisoned eagle, we don't always see the lead artifacts on the x-rays. And it could be because they're so small that it's accumulated enough to accumulate a high enough level to succumb to poisoning, or it's possible that the lead artifact or fragment or pellet was excreted, but the animal still succumbed to the lethal impacts of lead poisoning. So this is a couple radiographs of a lead poisoned eagle. These were two cases where we did, yes, absolutely find lead in their GI tract. The one on the right are lead shot pellets. The one on the left is a bullet fragment. It's a rather large bullet fragment, but a bullet fragment nonetheless. So last species group that I'll talk about tonight are common loons. So lead has been implicated as a significant mortality factor for loons in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New England. Fishing weights are the primary concern. Lead weights, unlike eagles, lead fishing weights are recovered in just about all lead poisoning cases. Restrictions are in place or have been proposed in several states, mostly up in New England. A few of the states have instituted restrictions on certain size of fishing weights. Just in the last few years, a group from New England actually published a paper that documented population level effects on loons due to exposure to lead fishing tackle. And that population level effect wasn't huge, but it was still statistically significant. And so, you have part of the country where, yep, they actually have documented some population level effects of fishing weights on loon populations. So how are loons exposed? Most likely, the lead sinkers are ingested with small stones and grit. Loons ingest small pebbles to help grind fish and aid in digestion. They also can consume fish that may have ingested lead or consume live bait with attached lead. And by far and away, most of the lead objects that are consumed by loons, they're less than 1 ounce, less than 1 inch long, and less than 1/2 inch wide. And so, these aren't big musky lures or anything like that. These are small jig head, split shot sinkers and bullet weights that are lost and are picked up by loons. So again, a similar graphic from what I showed with swans and eagles. The number one killer of loons are, believe it or not, other loons, territorial battles. We see a lot of trauma in loons, and I should back up a little bit. So between 2006 and 2016, we kind of undertook this project where we really wanted to get a handle on the impact of lead on loons. And so during that 10-year period, we necropsied every loon that was reported to the agency. And we came close to 100 cases. And about 25% of those were trauma, but lead was a close second. A little over 20% of the cases were lead toxicity. And predominantly for loons, they were adult birds, which makes it even a little bit more concerning because loons with they take so long to become sexually mature, and their reproductive rate is so low that kind of the population is so much dependent on adult survival. And so when you take these adults out of the population, it is concerning. So this is a radiograph of a lead poisoned loon, and my point is that that bright white teardrop shaped image is the head of a lead jig head, and you can see how similar they are to the stones that particular loon ingested, and you can see that the size range is identical or nearly identical. And so it's pretty clear that these loons are picking up these lead jigs and lead weights, thinking that they're grit. And unfortunately, many of them experience lead poisoning. So there's obvious, not surprisingly, problems associated with monitoring wildlife mortality events and lead exposure in these birds. You know, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, large scale lead related die-offs were obvious. You know, when you get hundreds upon hundreds of waterfowl that succumb to lead poisoning. But with the ban on lead poisoning, those large scale die-offs are rare. Every once in a while, again, like in a low water year, you might get groups of lead poisoned birds, but in large, they are not that common anymore. However, daily losses are often undetected. You know, when birds are lead poisoned, they don't feel good, so they isolate themselves, and then, you know, predation or scavenging can occur, you know, shortly after the onset of symptoms or death. You know, once a bird dies, you know, it becomes food for other creatures. And so just finding those carcasses is not easy, and the human detection of sick and dead birds is low. There are some interesting papers that were written years ago where they specifically, you know, went out and put waterfowl carcasses on the landscape and then tried to find them, and they don't. You know, it's less than 10%. You know, it may be higher for eagles and swans and loons simply because they're larger in size and they're, you know, a little bit more charismatic and people know what they are. But by and large, the detection of sick and dead birds is low. So just to wrap things up, lead is a mortality factor for several species of birds in Wisconsin. The source of lead is variable. You know, we have issues with lead shot and lead bullet fragments and lead fishing tackle, lead fishing weights. You know, we support programs to educate both anglers and hunters on the use of lead alternatives. And, you know, until the situation changes, you know, we expect to continue to see, you know, lead poisoned birds. And so until the amount of lead that's released into the environment is reduced, we don't expect the situation to change all that much. So I provided a few sources of information on our Wisconsin DNR website. Both we have a fisheries page and a wildlife page that provides some information on making choices to switch to non-lead ammunition or tackle. The Loon Watch program out of Northland College has a very good web page. And then there's some relatively new groups that are very helpful spreading the word to both hunting and fishing communities. Sporting Lead Free, the North American Non-Lead Partnership, and Hunting with Non-Lead. They all have great websites. So I strongly encourage, if you're interested, to check out these groups. They have some excellent information, and most of them have information on where hunters and anglers can find non-lead or alternatives to lead bullets and lead fishing weights. And just a few acknowledgements. Mike Meyer, who's now a retired DNR toxicologist. I worked with him a lot with the loon and eagle data. Brian Beard was the professor at UW-Madison who did all the lead stable isotope work. And then the DNR's Wildlife Health Program and Bureau of Natural Heritage and Conservation also helped collect all this data. And I will just leave you with my contact information. If you have any questions or forget about something and want to reach out to me, my email address is up there. So feel free to get in touch.
Great, thank you, Sean. We do have a couple of questions, so I'll just read them out of the chat, and then if anyone else has any, you can type them in, or we can get to a point where you can just raise your hand and ask them yourself. So Barry's wondering, what is the current status of upland game bird or other ammunition regulations here in Wisconsin? Any hope to further get the lead out?
In terms of regulations, I am not aware of anything on the horizon. You may be familiar with our Wisconsin Conservation Congress. And a few years ago, there were several questions that kind of gauged the hunting community's thoughts on non-lead use. And I think the interest is growing, but as of right now, there is not anything in terms of regulations on the radar. There's nothing pending or anything like that. However, I will say that just within the last month, the DNR has kickstarted their internal lead working group. And this group is going to try to come up with some education and outreach efforts to encourage both hunters and anglers to consider switching to alternatives to lead ammunition and fishing weights. And again, we just started the group, and so maybe a year from now we'll have some more concrete outreach efforts, but we're just starting to brainstorm right now.
Barry, does that answer your question, or do you have any follow-up for Sean?
No, that's really great. Thank you very much.
And do you want to elaborate on your question? She says, if California can do it, can Wisconsin as well?
Yeah, I was just following up on Barry's question. Thank you, Sean. That was great. Or are not great, depending on how you want to look at it. But thank you. That was great information. I just wondered kind of what I remember those Conservation Congress questions, and I just wondered, what the word on the street was. Some people need to be forced to change, because if they don't have to, they won't, because it's troublesome. So
yeah, and like I said, there's nothing on the regulatory front on the horizon right now. a few years ago, we started a program of holding these copper bullet demonstrations for deer hunters. And, that program was kind of put on the shelf, but we're hoping to dust it off again in the next year or so. But the good thing about those demonstrations is that they showed hunters the difference without being lectured to. And that was one thing that we wanted to be very careful of, is that, hunters don't want to be talked down to, they don't want to be lectured to. And so the point of these demonstrations was, okay, this is what a lead bullet does. This is what a copper bullet does. You can see for yourself, you make the decision. And honestly, that approach, it works. It does change. It does change some opinions. You're never going to be able to change everyone's with this type of thing. But we had, in our little pilot program, we had it was received very well. So I'm hopeful that we can kind of dust that off and bring it back on a larger scale.
Thank you. Michael asked if there are any risks that come from using non-lead shot or ammunition. Like, are there risks of using copper, for example, to wildlife?
Sure. Much less. And so, copper, everything is toxic if you are exposed to too much of it. But when you compare the toxicity of copper to the toxicity of lead, it's not even close. So, that's really a not a concern. On the fishing side of it, back, about 20 or 30 years ago, there was a company that was interested in making lead fishing weights out of zinc. But as it turned out, that while not as toxic to lead, it was still fairly toxic to other creatures. And so they unfortunately had to put that on the shelf. But yeah, overall, the difference in toxicity is significant, to the point where it's not even close, where lead is far more toxic.
And what are the different options for materials for ammunition and tackle? I know copper isn't the only one, but I'm not sure what the others are.
For center fire rifle ammunition, so like that you would use for deer hunting, copper is by far and away the most common. There are some other alloys, but they're predominantly copper. For shot shell ammunition, since the federal ban was put in place in 1991, initially there was only steel, but over the course of time, there's a whole slew of different types of shot pellets. On the fishing end, tin is fairly popular. Tungsten is another one. Tungsten is fair amount more expensive, but it's actually fairly popular with ice fishermen, ice anglers, because it's so dense, you can use a much smaller jig to get down into the water just as fast.
A couple of folks have asked about what the cost difference is in these different materials. Are they prohibitive to use as an alternative?
Sure. So I'll start with the rifle bullets. So there's kind of different types of rifle bullets. There's, the real cheap stuff that oftentimes is the worst in terms of fragmenting, but then there's also other, what's referred to as premium lead ammunition. And these they're still lead bullets, but they retain their weight a little bit more. And so that the cost of those premium lead bullets are very similar to the cost of the copper bullets. And so you kind of have to compare apples with apples, where, those copper bullets are kind of in line with those premium lead ammunition. On the fishing end of it, there is a difference. I mean, you read some stories on the internet and it's like it's only pennies different. And if you look, that's really not the case. You know, the tin jigs are probably the least expensive of all of the non-lead fishing weights. I mentioned tungsten, which is growing in popularity. It is more expensive, but it's actually becoming more popular because of the performance part of it. So if you find out that something performs better, hunters and anglers are willing to pay the extra price.
Sure. And if someone has a collection of lead tackle, for example, is there someplace they can bring it if they want to dispose of it responsibly?
Yes. If you go to our website and I think if you type in like lead fishing weights or something like that, I believe there is a list of places where you can take it that will either dispose of it or recycle it.
Okay, a few more questions. We have lots of great questions in the chat. Can burying gut piles help, or should the gut piles be removed?
Well, burying them is an issue simply because oftentimes, you know, during, for example, during our 9-day gun hunt, depending on the weather, the ground is frozen. So burying the gut piles really isn't an option other than, you know, burying it under branches or vegetation or something like that. But if you do that, you know, something can always get at it. And so, you know, in a perfect world, if you're using lead ammunition and you don't want the gut piles to remain on the landscape, yeah, hauling them out is one way to ensure that they won't be exposed, or wildlife won't be exposed to it.
Drew, did you have any follow-up to that question, or does that answer what you were asking?
No, nothing further. Thanks.
All right, let me scan through. Are cranes affected in any way by lead exposure?
We have not looked at a lot at lead exposure in cranes. All I will say is that, you know, all birds, you know, can succumb to lead poisoning. It's more a matter of exposure. And so, you know, if a crane is feeding in a field where there was a lot of shooting going on, you know, yes, theoretically, they could be exposed, but probably less common compared to those other species that I talked about, such as eagles or swans.
Hi, this is Barry. I have a comment regarding that. I'm the veterinarian at the International Crane Foundation, and we published a study just last year about lead exposure in whooping cranes in the reintroduced flock here in the state. And actually over about a 17-year period, and it took us a long time to generate that data, much like a lot of what Sean has shown. We think that about 5% of the birds in the reintroduced population during that time had elevated levels of lead in their system. So just as a point of comparison.
Awesome. Thank you, Barry, for that insight. Let me see. Donna is asking what it will take for us as hunters and anglers and residents in Wisconsin to help the DNR change or enact new laws of protection in regard to lead usage. So what is it? And you addressed some of this earlier, Sean. So if you have anything else that you want to elaborate on.
Yeah, I'll just kind of reiterate what I had said earlier, that, you know, the department right now is not in a position where they're considering any sort of administrative rule or laws or restrictions or anything like that. You know, but I think it's encouraging now that we're going to start up, you know, this outreach program. And hopefully get people to consider switching. If I had a magic wand, yeah, I'd love to wave it and just get rid of this stuff. But in reality, I think just the fact that we can do some of this outreach has to be considered a positive as well.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions? Anyone who didn't get a chance to type your question in or would rather ask it directly, feel free to unmute and ask at this point. Okay. Mark, I see you just unmuted, so I'll let you ask your
I had a
question.
comment, Sean, and in the 90s, when they coming up with they phased out, it was a mandate, phase out lead shot for waterfowl. I mean, we heard all the rumors it wasn't nothing could replace lead and everything and stuff like that. Finally, when they did it, the duck hunters realized they had a lot more ducks around, and it was something that everybody just thinks is common sense now with ducks, but it's odd that we can't do that with fish and eagles and everything else, and people eating the lead. When the article that Paul Smith put out in the journal, it was unbelievable how much lead, those small fragments of lead went throughout the deer, I mean, compared to the copper that he showed. And so why would anybody want to eat this weekend? They're going to go out shooting deer. Why would anybody want to eat the lead shot? I can't believe it.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of hunters, and if you let me kind of go off on a tangent a little bit, they'll say, I've been eating venison my entire life and I've never gotten sick. And the point is the analogy that I use is like, I refer to it as my peanut butter analogy. So, you may have used the same peanut butter all your life. It's great. It tastes delicious. It spreads on the bread evenly. It's cheap. The only downside is that, maybe 8-10% of those peanut butter jars have some lead in them. Now, if above that jar is one that tastes just as good, it spreads just as evenly, it might be a little bit more expensive, but it's guaranteed not to have any lead in it. And I ask them, it's like, well, which one are you going to choose for your family? And it makes them think a little bit. And so I've used that analogy a lot, and it's kind of gotten hunters to think a little bit. So yeah, I mean, those are all valid points. And like I said, hopefully with some of these outreach efforts, we can change some minds.
Great, thank you. Larry's wondering about the efficacy of the Conservation Congress and how effective is it to submit questions to the Congress about banning lead in ammunition and tackle?
Yeah, I really don't have an answer to, since, I'm familiar with all the questions that have been proposed over the years, but not really involved with them all that directly. The department has a Congress liaison, so maybe reach out. I think her name is Kari Lee Zimmerman, and that would be a good question for Kari.
Okay, great. Larry, any follow-up to that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
I got a follow-up question yet, Brenna.
Okay, go for it.
What's interesting is the DNR does not regulate lead. It kills a lot of eagles. And Marge Gibson up there at Reggie is rehabbing all these eagles. And it'd be nice for the state to say, look, it's our problem. We don't want to regulate it. The sportsmen can't afford it and everything, but we're going to cover the cost of your eagles for rehabbing that are taken in. It'd be nice to do. It's not going to cost millions of dollars, but here Reggie's trying to do it all on her own. Marges, but that's my comment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I know Marge. I've known Marge throughout my entire career and know very familiar with the number of not only eagles, but loons and swans she takes in. And yeah, it's a good point. I really don't have an answer, although other than to say that you're not the first one to propose or suggest that.
I'll just follow up. You know where we could pay for it from all the PR, Pittman Robertson dollars that are coming in, excise tax on ammunition. That could pay for, that'd be a drop in the bucket to pay for Marge and anybody else rehabbing anything with lead in it. Wisconsin wouldn't even make a dent in the DNR's budget, is my comment.
Yeah, good idea.
All right, well, I think that we are at the end of our question list. Caitlin, is there anyone on Facebook that has a question we want to present?
Yeah, I'll just chime in to quickly say, I think all the Facebook questions have also been answered. Some nice notes saying, thanks, Sean, for the presentation. And yeah, as you do outreach, keep the birding community in mind, because a lot of folks are interested in continuing to learn more as this project continues.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for being part of tonight's event. Thank you so much to Sean for being here and sharing all of this information and wisdom. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to Sean directly, and I can, if you contact me or Caitlin, we can pass it on to Sean as well. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you soon.